often, if you ask students, give me science, tell me about science, what science is, and give me some scientific discoveries, right? And it always comes from a Western European perspective, and that's what we're taught, right? To me, science is making observations about the natural world, being able to make some predictions and seeing whether those predictions are right, right? And every culture in the world has done that.
Welcome to the second season of Can I Get a Retake, the podcast where education gets innovative. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Michaela. Join us each month as we dive into the trends and technologies shaping the future of higher education.
Stay curious, stay inspired, and come learn with us from today's educators. Today's guest is blazing trails for underrepresented groups in STEM and conservation sciences. Dr. Erim Gómez, an assistant professor of wildlife biology at the renowned College of Forestry and Conservation in the University of Montana, is passionate about his craft and his community. As a conservationist, Erim has dedicated years to studying amphibians and other charismatic minifauna, working to preserve species and life forms that have existed for billions of years. As an educator and advocate, he champions inclusion of diverse voices in STEM fields. His initiatives include establishing a local chapter of the Society for Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, as well as serving on the university's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Erim holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies from Southern Oregon University and Master's and PhD in Natural Resource Sciences from Washington State University. He is also a co-author of the GRL title, An Introduction to Wildlife Management and Conservation in North America, where he focuses on the many career paths available to conservation students. Thank you for joining us today, Erim. Tell us your story. How did you come to become passionate about conservation and wildlife biology?
I am glad you asked that question. When I was 5 years old, I saw this video of these two guys, what I thought was with the wrestling and studying grizzly bears. And then I remember seeing that, and I'm like, wait, that's a job you can like work with grizzly bears in the wild. And then, that got me into nature documentaries, and we would watch nature documentaries as a family. And then, David Attenborough talking about amphibians in the Amazon. And I'm like, great. I want to do grizzly bear work. I probably just done bear work and work with amphibians in the Amazon. When I moved from California to Oregon as a child, or I was about 11 years old. I had a really good high school teacher, and then when I moved up to high school, he moved up to high school, and we had a natural resource science program, and we had an actual salmon hatchery. It was student run. It was relatively small. It felt big to us, like 30,000 salmon. This is small. Big hatchery has to have millions of salmon. They're small salmon. And so through that, I ended up learning that there was a career path. And then I just kind of leaned into where my opportunities came. Most of my opportunities ended up coming for the most part in aquatic ecosystems. And after 1 year here, I just somehow had not made the connection of the video and whose video I had seen. It wasn't until I was literally, I think it was my third semester here, so after my first full year, I invited a retired speaker from Idaho Fish and Game, and he said, "This is why I became a biologist." And he puts that clip, and it's the same clip. And then he said, "This is why I came to the University of Montana, because I wanted to study with these guys." And one of those professors was John Craighead, who was a professor in the same program that I'm a professor in. And I didn't connect the dots before I saw that video. Do I do grizzly bear research now? I've had students do camera trapping work with data sets and work with local agencies to do some very just population level stuff. And I have done some work in the Amazon with amphibians. I will say I actually prefer the amphibian work, because when you work with smaller critters, or charismatic minifauna, as I like to call them, you get to interact with them often. You interact with more individuals, you trap more individuals. It's safer, obviously it's easier on the wildlife and on the human, right? When you're working with bigger charismatic animals, there's so many more safety concerns. And then when you're working with mammals, there's transmission disease safety concerns. Either you giving something to them or them giving something to you, which isn't as high when you're working with smaller, non-mammalian species.
Thank you for clarifying what charismatic minifauna meant, because I saw that as one of your research interests, and I wasn't sure. I didn't tie that to amphibians, which I saw makes up quite a bit of your academic research background. So that's great qualifier. Thank you.
I also had to Google that.
My lab is actually the charismatic minifauna lab.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that because a lot of my students, undergraduate students, understandably so, I teach at the University of Montana, home of the Grizz, right? That is our mascot. And a lot of my students, kind of like myself, wanted to work with those big charismatic animals. But most of the people that get into this field want to work with those big charismatic animals. And so I realized, since my opportunities came with smaller organisms, I leaned into it, and so when I work with the animals that other people might not consider charismatic, I argue that all wildlife is charismatic. And working with them is like working for literally the little guy, right? The one that doesn't get the same attention, doesn't get the same funding, doesn't get the same research and conservation needs that they have. I mean, the most endangered vertebrate animal group besides corals is amphibians. 40% of the species of amphibians in the world are threatened with extinction.
When it comes to that, I think we did have a question in there, which was, it's hard for some people who don't understand the influence that part of the ecosystem or the biosphere has on human life. Or they might say, well, what does it matter to us because it doesn't have an impact that I can see? How do you talk to people about the need to do this research?
The conservation community actually has a debate on how do we actually answer that question. And so I'll answer it two ways. I'll answer it the way to get buy-in, from probably the best way, but then I'm going to give you my personal perspective. And the way you get buy-in from people is that you generally explain that, that some of these smaller organisms are often important. They provide food for other organisms that we do care about. Maybe, birds provide foods amphibians provide foods for maybe fish species, or food for, bird species, right? Like people love, I've seen so many photos out west of the great blue heron, right? Who loves to eat fish and frogs, right? They serve important ecological roles as well, right? So if you keep on removing species from an ecosystem, even if you're removing small species, it's like a Jenga, it will fall apart, right? But I would also be honest and say that I don't think all species are as important when it comes to those ecosystem services. And I don't think as a scientist, I can always make that argument. And so if I only leaned into that argument, we could replace a bunch of amphibian species out west with non-native bullfrogs. They're not native out west here, right? And so you could end up having fill that hole with another species. My perspective is I generally ask, what is some archaeological site or a piece of artwork that's old that you would be sad to hear about it disappeared? For me, as a Mexican American, it would be Chichen Itza, the largest of the Mayan temples. Heck, I used to say I had never seen the Mona Lisa. I actually did about a year ago. I would be bummed out if someone burnt down the Mona Lisa. It's not even, not even the best art, but like I would still be bummed out. And you think of amphibians or the other critters that don't get the same amount of attention. They've been evolving since life began, estimated 3.7, 4.2 billion years ago. They emerged, 350, 360 million years ago. They have survived as a group. They have survived multiple mass extinctions. They were here before the dinosaurs and after the dinosaurs, including things that we think are dinosaurs that aren't actually dinosaurs. And right now they're facing a mass extinction, and they're facing it because of what we're doing to the ecosystem, whether that's resource extraction, whether that's moving invasive species across the landscape, introducing disease accidentally, changing habitat or altering habitat, and climate change.
So when you're teaching, you do incorporate a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, and this was something that I really wanted to talk to you about.
So I start in the textbook. We asked some indigenous scientists and managers to start a textbook with Native American perspectives on natural resource management, specifically wildlife management. We do that because when I was a student, when my co-authors were a student, when the chapter authors were students, we were taught that the North America was pristine, relatively untouched by humans, not managed, and then humans got on the landscape and then altered it for the first time. That's just simply not true. Right. Native Americans were managing the ecosystem. They would, there's a great photo from the Bitterroot Mountains from over about 140 years ago. And it shows what it looked like under Native American management. And what it looked like was you had these taller, older trees, you had these open landscapes underneath, you didn't have a lot of vegetation. Fire had been going through there on a regular basis, some natural fire, but often Native Americans would actively introduce fire. It led to understory growth that was food for the deer species that they like to consume. It also created, it would create emergence in habitat for plant species, berries, huckleberries, that would come along after an initial burn. And then from that same photo, you look at what it looks like through time from the exact same spot. And, they took a photo the late 1800s, 1900s, and then in the 1940s. And then you see this encroachment, like there's a lot more vegetation. Trees are still, there's a lot more vegetation. And then they took the same photo in the late 80s from the exact same point. And you almost can't even see the trees anymore. Now it's just so much literally heavy vegetation. You can kind of pick out some of the trees. And so the ecosystem was being managed already. We have archaeological evidence that bison populations were higher between tribal nations, right? Likely either because maybe the bison were moving away from the hunting, or because Native Americans were reducing the population. So the reason I start with it is because there was people on this land that were already managing the ecosystem, right? And North America is not what we think of as wilderness, right? There is estimated 11 million people in North America at when, late 1400s. So if we're trying to be honest about the history, and we spend several chapters talking about the history of wildlife management, we have to include the Native American perspective. Plus, and not that it's one perspective, there's obviously multiple perspectives, but there is some common thread oftentimes. And so I encourage my students to, whenever they go get jobs and become managers and biologists, is to learn not just the biological history, but the cultural history of the ecosystems that they're working in.
So you're obviously teaching your students about the history, but are there specific practices that we're continuing from, indigenous practices that are now also staying in the current curriculum for conservation? Or is it just we're assuming that it's the same things that we're doing, it just happened earlier?
I would say that, we tend to think of science as often, if you ask students, give me science, tell me about science, what science is, and give me some scientific discoveries, right? And it always comes from a Western European perspective, and that's what we're taught, right? To me, science is making observations about the natural world, being able to make some predictions and seeing whether those predictions are right? And every culture in the world has done that. We, for nearly 100 years out west, did heavy fire suppression. Locally, there's historical documents that forest rangers would actively stop tribal members from setting cultural burns. And now, after decades, century of doing this, Western science has been like, oh, wait, we were doing this wrong. There's species that evolved on the landscape with fire. Ecosystems are more resilient with fire. Of course they are. If you think about it evolutionarily, fire was always a natural part of the ecosystem. So species and the complexity of the ecosystems were going to evolve with strategies to deal with that or to benefit that. I mean, there's species of conifer evergreens that need fire for their seeds to be dispersed. And if we haven't had fire in big chunks of the landscape, well, we're not going to see that species. Additionally, we're having higher rates of higher intensity fires, right? High intensity fires have always been a thing, but we're seeing them at a much larger rate because what we say is we've allowed the fuels to build up over a century. And that, high intensity fires are a natural part of the landscape as well. But it's like anything, you're too much of one thing can be a bad thing, right? For the ecosystem. I think where it also comes, not just the management component where Native American perspectives come in, is how we think about management. We're taught from the North American model of wildlife management, that is heavy historically on a game focus. That's changing. We're starting to care about the non-game, the things that we don't hunt or harvest or catch. But historically, conservation in the United States, as we think of the United States, was focused on those things that we like to harvest. And that's a different relationship. There's respect. Hunters have respect for the things that they harvest. But here in Missoula, we have a few rivers that all connect: the Blackfoot River, the Clark Fork River, the Bitterroot River. We do a lot of catch and release fishing, and that is taught from. It's great, right? You get the enjoyment from catching it, that animal, and then you can release it give the opportunity to catch it, have someone else catch it. I was in a class with a friend of mine who is a member of the Confederated Colville tribe, and he was a graduate student as well when I was a graduate student, and the topic of catch and release fishing came up. And I asked, oh, what's your perspective on that? And this is his perspective, not say that it's everyone's perspective, every Native American's perspective, but he was like, if you're going to catch that animal, then you should honor it by consuming it. And if you're not going to consume it, then you're just playing with the animal. And that is a completely different way of looking at that relationship. And I think my students are better prepared if they can look at management from different perspectives, that they can look at science from different perspectives and different values. I think the more lenses you see the world through, the better you're able to address problems and issues, right? And so while, I'm not advocating for or against catch and release fishing, I do think that that's one of those examples of how trying to learn about the culture of and indigenous perspectives of the communities we live and work in make us better managers.
When it comes to students that are in wildlife biology right now, going into conservation, what benefit does conservation as a whole have when those students represent the full range of humanity, of gender, of age, of diversity and ethnicity?
I'll give you a concrete personal example, but broadly speaking, it's the same. There's research that when there's more diverse perspectives and you have people from diverse backgrounds, that you come up with more creative solutions. So there's a whole slew of research on this, whether that be solutions to healthcare, to business solutions, to engineering or wildlife management. There's data that suggests that is the diversity of backgrounds gives you diversity of thought and diversity of solutions. But, being a person that's underrepresented in this field as a Mexican American, I do think it does influence the way that I look at wildlife management. Dr. Chad Bishop, who is editor and actually helped get the ball rolling on this textbook, he is an ungulate biologist. The term for everyone, it's deer, right? He's a deer biologist. He's a deer biologist because he loves hunting, and probably kind of maybe even as a kid, some of my favorite memories are hunting, not deer. It was jackrabbits in California, but hunting jackrabbits in California. Chad's experience hunting with his brother, his family, is really important to him. It is why he became a wildlife biologist, right? It is why he cares about ungulate species and deer species. Me as a Mexican American, it does influence what I care about. And so, again, kind of going back to that charismatic minifauna approach, it's like working for the underrepresented guy, right? Mm-hmm. Working for those critters that don't get the same attention, don't always get the same love as some of what people would consider more charismatic or larger or connection. When you look at our conservation dollars in the wildlife field, they go to mammals and they go to birds, right? And the more colorful or bigger they are, bird-wise, the more funding that they get, right? Recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this was in October, I believe, removed 20 some odd species from the endangered species list. And I saw that, I'm like, great news. And then I looked, they were removed because they were believed to be extinct. And if you looked at them, what species they were, it was a couple birds and a bunch of, non-game, there's some non-game fish and non-game mussels, and invertebrates essentially. And you're like, oh, yeah, we're not going to spend as much money or time conserving those species, right? Because they don't have the same, I guess, public backing, right? And there's ecological reasons of why we would do that, right? That I won't argue that all species are important to the ecosystem as every other species, at least ecologically. We could have a values argument of whether that's true. Obviously, I think as a conservation biologist that they do have value in and of themselves, whether we get any value. That is my personal value, but I'm not going to argue that they're each contributing to the ecosystem equally, which I know that's actually not the case. And so, being underrepresented in the field, I'd like to work with the underrepresented organisms.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Dr. Erim Gómez. We hope you'll tune in for part 2, where we'll shift our focus from advocating for amphibians to supporting students, especially those traditionally underrepresented in conservation. See you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Can I Get a Retake, a podcast by Great River Learning. If you liked the episode, show your support by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. For detailed show notes and transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com.
Can I Get a Retake is brought to you by hosts Michaela Elby and Michelle Manneman, with editing by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast is crafted by myself, and our intro music is courtesy of Comma Media. We'll be back soon with another captivating chat with a top GRL innovator.